and the Council of State. I am going to do a quick overview today on why this matters to the Department of Defense, a little bit about what the cooperative agreement is, and a little bit about working with the Defense State Liaison Office. So on to the next slide. Again, this slide really highlights why taking care of our military families is important. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in a 2022 memo just last September that taking care of our service members and our families is of the utmost importance. And we also have seen this reiterated multiple times by our leadership, Dr. Jill Biden, talking about the importance of caring for our families and our service members, our veterans, our caregivers, and survivors. This leads us to think about how we can best do that. And on the next slide, we see that why licensure matters, why it matters as an element of taking care of our military service members. Our military service members aren't service members that stand alone. They stand with families. And our military spouses currently face a 20% unemployment rate. 36% of those military spouses require an occupational license to work. And our data from our most recent active duty spouse survey shows that 3% of those spouses report requiring a social work license. That's why this compact is important. We want those military spouses to be able to more easily ensure that they're able to work when they move from state to state, which they do multiple times during their careers. Our unemployed spouses had a significantly higher reporting rate that they required an occupational license to work in their preferred profession. That's why we see compacts like the one that we're talking about today as being so important to reduce this unemployment rate for our military spouses and reduce that burden on transferring a license. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit about the cooperative agreement. So we knew that these challenges have been out there for over a decade. And in 2020, the National Defense Authorization Act gave us a way forward on how to solve some of these challenges around military spouse licensure portability. And it gave us the opportunity to enter into a cooperative agreement with the Council of State Governments and the National Center for Interstate Compacts, the experts on how to fix this problem. This cooperative agreement provides grant opportunities to specific occupations like social work to develop occupational licensure compacts. We often refer to occupational licensure compacts as the gold standard or the best option for licensure portability for our military spouses. So when we are working on getting the social work compact implemented and passed in states, you can work with the Defense State Liaison Office. Our office, on the next slide you'll see, is a group of folks that work across the nation to support our military spouses or military families. I'm located out in the West Coast, and you can see my region in red, but I have colleagues all across the nation that are specifically there to work with state policymakers, state boards, and other stakeholders to ensure this legislation is implemented to support our military families. We're not lobbyists. We provide education, information, and resources to help move forward this important priority for the Department of Defense. You can reach out to us at any time, and on the next slide, you'll see a QR code on how you can reach your specific regional liaison. You can also contact me on my cell phone number or my email address here that I'll also pop in the chat, and I can get you in touch with your regional liaison. But we're here to come along side by side for you and support you as you work on this effort, because it's important for us and it's important for our military families. Thank you so much for this time. Grant, back over to you.
Thanks so much, Tammy, and thanks for all the work you've done on part of this cooperative agreement. It seems like a lot of progress has been made in social work and many other professions as well, but we couldn't do that work without incredible help from our project partners on the social work licensure compact from the Association of Social Work Boards. And we're fortunate enough today to have Jennifer Hinkle from ASWB and Kara Sander from ASWB as well to join us today to speak a little bit on the regulation of social work practice in the United States and some of the issues with interstate practice. So Jennifer and Kara, I will hand it over to you now.
Great, thanks so much. Nice to see everybody. Kara's gonna get her screen up and drive this bus, so we'll give her a second to get all set. Thank you, Tammy, for all that really helpful information and context setting. That was great. So while Kara is pulling up our slideshow, let me tell you a little bit about what ASWB is. The Association of Social Work Boards is the nonprofit organization composed of the social work regulatory boards, other view, Kara, and colleges in all 50 states, DC, Virgin Islands, Guam, CNMI, and all 10 Canadian provinces. And big shout out, I see lots of ASWB friends and regulators on this call. Nice to see some familiar faces here. Kristen and Phil and Bora, others on other screens as well, but I saw you, I wrote your names down. Happy to have you here with us. I'm Jennifer Henkel. I'm the Senior Director of Member Engagement and Regulatory Services at ASWB. And when Kara gets to her slide, I'll let her introduce herself as well.
Excuse me, so Jennifer, how is that? So apologize.
Nope, you got it. That's perfect.
Great.
So you can, I guess you can go to the next one, but you're going to introduce yourself when you start talking.
Sure, I'm happy to introduce myself. Hello, folks, and I hope you found this to be slightly entertaining. My name is Kara Sanner. I'm a program manager within the MERS department at ASWB, and I've been working with Jennifer to provide support in the development and implementation of the compact. Happy to be here with you today. Thank you.
So when CSG asked us to present, they asked us to give a little bit of overview about social work licensing in the US. And so we're going to do that. And I'm also going to offer a little context about how we decided to become a part of the compact development process. Our information and our research is really grounded in our Social Work Practice Act, sometimes called the Model Law by internal folks. And so this model law is developed and written by ASWB's 64 members, and it's updated to reflect changes in practice and changes in social work practice specifically, and also changes in regulations. So a lot of the information we're going to share is really based on this model law. Next slide. So Tammy told us why why licensure, not just social work licensure, is important to military families. I want to set a little stage about why social work is licensed at all. So the regulators on here have a lens, lots of NASW folks on here as well. I think we can all appreciate that the practice of social work really impacts the health, safety, and welfare of very vulnerable populations. And licensure makes sure that the public can have the confidence that only qualified persons are permitted to become licensed to engage in the practice. So little context setting, but I don't think it's controversial about why social work is licensed. To make life easier, I'm going to pretend that we all agree on this, but we know there's some differences across the states. But this reflects the model law, and it's really a simplification of licensure in the US, but it is also reflective of the majority of the states in the US. Social work is licensed in 3 categories that are defined by title, scope, and then they have entry to practice requirements. So they have a name that reflects it, the scope of practice, what social workers are allowed to do under that title, and what the practice requirements are to obtain that title. So we've got the practice of baccalaureate social work, master's, and clinical. You don't need to read those, but it just lets you know this is our landscape, if you will. So Kara's going to highlight where we are right now.
Sure, yes. Social work is estimated to be the largest of the mental health service providers in the US, and that's including combining psychiatrists, psychologists, and clinical psychiatric nurses. So social work is certainly a very large profession. We estimate that there are almost 600,000 licensed social workers, with clinical social workers making up 64% of that population. And in the last 10 years, we have seen about a 36% increase in the number of licensed social workers, as reported to us by state regulatory authorities. And we included this map to really demonstrate the differences across the states with respect to access to licensed social work services. And I think this really underscores the need for licensure mobility and portability to increase access to qualified social workers. We will share these slides after today's presentation, and there's a link there. There's a number of interactive maps on our website that might be interesting to you. States have three primary provisions to facilitate licensure mobility and portability. As you can see there, it's primarily endorsement or reciprocity, which creates a pathway for individuals who are licensed in good standing in another state to practice in your state or the current state. I think in the last 5 years, as Jennifer will know, there has been some changes with respect to endorsement or reciprocity to really facilitate ease of licensure. However, those provisions still require application in each state in which the social worker intends to practice. And there are a number of states that really emphasize substantial equivalency. So they're really scrutinizing those individuals' qualifications that granted them licensure, and maybe not considering their many years of licensed practice and good standing as demonstrating competence to practice. In more recent years, we've seen an increase in the use of temporary practice provisions, which grants sort of a provisional practice period for individuals if they're licensed in another state. There's nothing additional that they need to do. They can simply practice for 30 to 60 days, or in the event of a declared emergency. And then even more recently are the development of telehealth registrations, which requires a simple registration process. There are 3 states that have added that in the last couple of years. But as you can see, the drawbacks for temporary practice and telehealth registration is that they're just not widely adopted.
It's an exciting animated slide for all of you. I know you really needed something fun and exciting visually. So I want to talk about the history and what led us to this compact development. Next slide, Kara. So we've got this really small timeline on there, but I want to highlight that ASWB really started looking at options for mobility and portability in 2013. We started as part of our strategic plan. We had an international technology task force in which we had NASW, CSWE, the Clinical Social Work Association, and other partners were part of that. So even in 2013, we were thinking about practicing across state and provincial lines and what that looked like. Obviously, all of us lived through COVID. We know we were forced into figuring that out with or without these nice tech standards we had researched and written. But then we had several conferences focusing on mobility and portability. We did a lot of interviews with membership, surveys, research, exhaustive. And so at the end of all of that research, we thought we came up with the solution. So we modified our model law to support qualifications for licensure by endorsement. And we really thought that was the solution. However, it didn't work as well as we had hoped, as Kara listed some of the hurdles and some of the barriers to make that work seamlessly. And at the same time, compacts were becoming a lot more attractive to other professions. So when this DoD CSG cooperative agreement came available, we thought we would be silly to not apply and see how this would help social work. And so we're very happy that we got this opportunity. So next slide is my little visual of this poor little snail who I think represents how quickly regulation can move sometimes in the world. We're a little slow, but he's found his way through the barriers and over barriers. So I do want to give a thank you to the Department of Defense and especially to CSG, because We alone could not have done this at ASWB. I don't even think could have done it with our partner organizations, NASW and the Clinical Association, without the guidance of CSG and the Compact Center. So we're very grateful for their support and guidance with this. Now, speaking of that, here's some slides I stole from them. I do want to highlight the benefits of the Compact that really resonate for us and really help us to feel confident that this is the right direction for social work. Obviously, it eases mobility, expands opportunities, but for me, this third bullet is the most important because I really believe it allows for continuity of care for the clients. And I think those of you that have spent a long time building rapport with clients know how important that is to have that continuity of care and to be able to do that warm handoff. It also allows us to leverage technology, and it supports the relocating military families. Next slide. So for my licensing board friends that are on right now, how does this benefit you? Well, it's the shared data system, which is going to reduce the administrative burdens. But most importantly, in terms of public safety, is it expedites investigation and enforcement. I really think we cannot highlight that enough, especially when we know that at times bad actors will move from state to state. This shared system will really help us track that and make sure that doesn't happen. I know some of you social workers on the line think that there are probably no bad actors that are social workers. However, the regulators can tell you some stories that occasionally a social worker will act out. Yeah, I see some nods. Thank you for that. So that is a huge, important benefit. Reduces application processing time, cooperation among the states, and enhances public safety. So lots of benefits there. For the states, we are hearing it all the time. I'm sure you're hearing it in your jurisdictions as well. There are workforce shortages. So compacts created to help support the workforce shortages, expands consumer access to highly qualified social workers. And I would also say specifically qualified social worker, people with specialties. The compact will allow folks to get access to certain specialties. Maybe the only person who specializes in that type of trauma care is in Maine, and I live in Colorado. The compact will help get access to those specializations and that level of care. And of course, preserve state sovereignty, which we all appreciate on this CSG and ASWB, as well as all of our regulators. We get how important that is. So lots of benefits there. I know we have time for questions at the end of the presentations today. So if you want to think about those, but I appreciate your time and your attention. And as Kara said, we'll share the slides, and she and I are both available for any questions you might have about ASWB and how we can support you with regulations. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jennifer and Kara, for that. As Jennifer mentioned, we are taking questions, so feel free to pop those in the chat and we will address those a little later in the presentation. I want to thank you again, Kara and Jennifer, for being here today and working to enhance licensure portability and access to services by way of interstate compacts. But now we've got our introductions and background out of the way. We're going to head into the meat and potatoes section of today's presentation. And for that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Matt Schaefer.
Great. Thank you, Grant. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, I guess, depending on what time, what area of the country you're in. Matt Schaefer. I'm the Deputy Program Director at the CSG National Center for Interstate Compacts. And like Grant said, I'm here to give the detailed overview of the compact. So we'll talk about compacts generally, their history and use by other professions, and then we'll get into the specifics of the social work compact. And also, like Grant said, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to drop those in the chat, and we'll be collecting all of those and walking through them during the Q&A portion later on in the meeting. Okay, so just to start out at square one, to make sure that we all have an understanding of what we're talking about here, what is an interstate compact? So what we're talking about is a legal contract between states. So just as individual people can enter into contractual relationships with one another. States can do the same thing. And this is done by the state legislature. So it's a legal contract enacted by the state legislature between two or more states. And so that's a common question that we get is, how does my state actually join the compact? It's not a decision of the regulatory board. It's not a decision of the governor's office. It's a decision of the state legislature. And the compact legislation needs to go through the legislative process and be signed into law in order for your state to officially become a member and participate. You can see the picture there on your screen of the driver's license, probably the most common example of an interstate compact that we can point to. So your ability as a motor vehicleist to hold one license issued by your state of residence and drive anywhere else you want in the country, that's all facilitated by the driver's license compact. And a lot of these occupational licensing compacts really function in a similar manner, whereby you are maintaining one license to practice, and that authorizes you to be able to practice in other compact member states. So it's a helpful analogy that we'll use throughout the presentation today. So over the past decade or so, we've seen a real explosion of interest in states and professions specifically using these licensure compacts to facilitate mobility, to solve problems around portability of licensure, practicing in multiple states. And so really, when it comes down to it at a fundamental level, the goal of all of these licensure compacts is to facilitate multi-state practice. So you, rather than having to navigate each state's individual state-specific licensing process, you maintain one license, and via the compact, you have the ability to practice in other compact member states without having to go through the licensure process there. Now, the form and function of all of the different interstate compacts vary from compact to compact. So actually how they work is all unique to each compact, although there are some general themes about how they all operate. But at a very fundamental level, all they're trying to do is facilitate multi-state practice. We always make the point that they help maintain or improve public health and safety. This is largely down to the amount of information sharing that occurs between the member states that join the compact. So you're sharing things, you're required to share things via the compact, things like the availability of investigative information, adverse action, licensure data. So all of this is being shared between the member states. So it's really raising the bar around regulation in terms of the amount of information that boards have access to, and the amount of information they have to protect public health and safety in their state. And then lastly, we always like to point out, and Jennifer made this point as well, that compacts preserve state authority over professional licensing. So this is not a takeover of the current licensing system. This is just a additional optional pathway that a social worker can take advantage of if they want to work in multiple states. So the traditional single state licensure process maintains and stays in place. Scope of practice is untouched by the compact, so the compact doesn't dictate anything about what the state has to do around scope of practice. It just says we're creating this alternative pathway that states are agreeing to that allows for practice in multiple states. So the state retains control over licensing requirements in their state for their single state license, and then also retains control over their practice act. So in those senses, the compact really does preserve state sovereignty and state authority over the practice occurring within their state borders. You can see just how common these compacts are out in the state. So almost every state has adopted at least one of the licensure compacts. I think at this point, New York, Massachusetts, California, and Alaska are the only states that have not passed one yet. I think Alaska is pretty close, so I think that list will be trimmed down even more soon. You can see over or 40 states, DC and Guam have adopted at least 3. So most of the states have adopted multiple compacts at least. 289 pieces of compact legislation just in the past 7 years, and there's 15 professions that currently have these. Here is the list. You can see nursing and medicine lead the way with 41 member states each. These are the oldest compacts. They've been around since 2016. There's actually the second iteration of the nursing compact. It was originally drafted in the late 90s, and then they rewrote it in 2015. And then all of the other licensure compacts have followed since then. So see psychology and PT closely behind nursing and medicine. The compacts on the right side of your screen are, you can see the membership is lower, but that's really just because they're newer. They've only been out to the states for 1 legislative session, where all these other compacts have been out for at least 3 legislative sessions. So you can see another compact that's probably of interest to this audience would be the counseling compact. That was finalized in 2021. They got 2 states their first year, and now they're all the way up to 29 states. So just in the past 2 legislative sessions in 22 and 23, they've added 27 states, which is pretty remarkable. So don't get discouraged when you see social work with 1 member state. That's Missouri, that just enacted earlier this month. It's very common for in the first year only a couple states to adopt the compact, and then you see a real uptick in years 2 and 3. Okay, so just a little bit about the development process for the compact. So you can see we break it up into 3 phases. So we have the initial development, which is phase 1. Phase 2 is education and enactment. So that's where we're at currently. You can see the highlighted bullets there. The compact has been finalized. It's out to the states for enactment. And then phase 3 deals with the transition to the commission phase, which is actually the ongoing administration, the implementation of the compact once a certain number of states have passed it. So, but just to share a little bit about the development process, because people are usually interested in that. So we convened what we call the technical assistance group in partnership with NASW, CSWA, and ASWB, put together a diverse group of stakeholders to essentially create a framework for the compact, a set of recommendations, and then that framework was handed off to a much smaller group, which we call the document team. There's a couple folks from the document team that are here present today on the meeting, and they'll tell you it is a somewhat painstaking process where you're essentially drafting the compact, going line by line, ensuring that the compact language fits the intent and the needs that the technical assistance group identified. So we had a great document team to actually put pen to paper on the recommendations that were made from the technical assistance group. We hosted a public comment period where a draft of the compact was available to stakeholders to review and provide feedback and input on. That lasted a couple months last summer, and then we finalized the draft with our document team and technical assistance group and finished that up at the end of February. So it's been out to the states for about 5 months now, and like I mentioned on the previous slide, we have our first state, Missouri, to enact just a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so Jennifer talked a lot about these benefits. I'll just emphasize a couple of points. Obviously, the primary benefit we're talking about here, ease of mobility for licensees, expanding employment opportunities, so you're no longer limited to only working in the state where you're licensed, but you can expand your market share and explore new opportunities for employment. Obviously, telehealth is a huge benefit. during this process, working with social workers on the compact, we've heard of social workers having over 20 licenses, over 20 individual state licenses. And so you can see the advantage of the compact, especially in those scenarios where you're working in telehealth, working in many states at one time. You're eliminating the need for all of those licenses. You just maintain one, and then you can still practice in all 20 of those states as long as they're members of the compact, obviously. And then Tammy very eloquently spoke to the perspective of the military spouse and their family. Jennifer mentioned the benefits to boards, so reduction of application processing time. It's also just a general reduced administrative burden because the state is not having to process as many out-of-state applications anymore. If you're a member of the compact and you're accustomed to, you know, receiving a lot of applications from folks who don't live in your state, if you're a part of the compact, that number might be significantly reduced. We always talk about the ability to conduct joint investigations, work together across state lines on investigations of practitioners using the compact, which is a big benefit for licensing boards. And then I mentioned the data system earlier, the amount of information sharing that occurs between the member states, and we'll talk about that more throughout the presentation as well. State legislators really like these primarily as a workforce development tool. So we hear all the time about access to care issues, especially in states with a lot of rural areas where there are significant practitioner shortages. The compact is a lever that a state can utilize in order to try to resolve some of these shortage areas. So it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of your state's shortages. But it is a solution amongst many other solutions to these problems around workforce shortages. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of the compact itself. So just a couple of terms that it will be important for you to understand if you're really getting into the weeds of how the compact works. So first term here, regulated social worker. This is kind of a hat tip to the fact that we're trying to fit 3 categories of practice into one compact, which is unique. All the other compacts really just deal with one category of licensure. So we're trying to fit 3 into one compact here, which is something that was challenging, but something I think we managed well through the drafting. So this is just our general umbrella term for a social worker, regardless of category, who wants to use the compact. So just a social worker who has a license to practice social work, regardless of whether they're an MSW or LCSW or BSW. Home state is any state that's a member of the compact where the regulated social worker is primarily domiciled. So this is your primary state of residence. It's how we define home state. A remote state is just any other state that has joined the compact besides the licensee's home state. A compact license or multi-state license is the license granted by the home state that authorizes practice in all other member states. So if you think back to the analogy of your driver's license, you hold one driver's license, you can drive anywhere you want. Same principle applies here. You hold one compact license or one multi-state license, and that authorizes you to practice social work in any other state that's a member of the compact. Multi-state authorization to practice. So we'll talk about this more when we get into the adverse action section, but this is essentially legal authorization granted via a multi-state license to practice in a single remote state. So this is the thing that the remote state has jurisdiction over. So let's say my license, my multi-state license was issued by my home state of Kentucky. Tennessee is also in the compact. So Tennessee has the ability to take an action against my authorization to practice in Tennessee. That's the thing that they have jurisdiction over. And then lastly, the Compact Commission or commission. This is just the governing body made up of all of the member states that administer and implement the compact on an ongoing basis. So ASWB, CSG, NASW, these groups don't have a role on the commission. The commission is made up of the member states themselves. So the states that join the compact get one representative to have a seat at the table and vote on behalf of their state on rules and regulations that will govern the compact. And we'll get into the specifics of the commission in a later slide, but it is the compact says it's a member of the state licensing board, or their designee is the person who will sit on the commission. Okay, so at a 10,000 foot level, how does the compact actually work? So you can see here, you got a social worker in their home state. They want to practice in other compact member states. So the primary thing the social worker needs to have first is a active unencumbered license. They have to hold or be eligible for an active unencumbered license in their home state. The or be eligible for is essentially allowing for a new graduate to be able to apply for a multi-state license for their very first license. So if you're graduating as a BSW, you've never held a license before, when you apply, if you want to use the compact and work in other states, you could initially apply for a multi-state license. So hold or be eligible for a license in their home state. They apply for the multi-state license. The home state is the one that receives that application, verifies that the social worker meets all of the compact's eligibility requirements, which we'll talk about in a few slides, and they will issue that multi-state license according to the category of license sought, or the license that they held previously. So if they have a master's category license, they're going to get a master's category multi-state license. And then so the multi-state license is issued. They now have authorization to practice in all other compact member states without any additional steps, action, notification necessary. Okay, so we're going to get into specific requirements that are in the compact. These are split into kind of two buckets of requirements. The first being in section 3 are state requirements to join the compact. So this is not anything that the social worker has to do. This is what the state has to have in place in terms of a threshold, a bar of regulation for social work. But don't confuse this with something that a social worker has to do. This is what the state has to already have in place before they can join the compact. So number 1, license and regulate social work in one or more of the following categories. So this is not saying that you have to regulate all 3 categories of social work. Like Jennifer and Kara mentioned, it's kind of a mix between the states. There's a lot of states that don't regulate all 3. Some might only regulate clinical, some might only regulate masters in clinical. So it's kind of a mixed bag out in the states. This is just saying that you have to regulate at least one of the categories in order to join the compact. So you can't deregulate social work completely and still expect to join this compact when you're not actually issuing licenses. Number 2, require for licensure that licensees graduate from a accredited social work program corresponding to the category of licensure sought. So BSW or higher for the bachelor social worker, MSW or higher for masters and clinical. Number 3, require that applicants for a multi-state license pass a qualifying national exam. So I just want to clarify this term a little bit. If you've looked at the compact language, you might be confused as to what exactly we mean by qualifying national exam. So the definition in the compact essentially says a national licensing exam approved by the Compact Commission. So currently, the only national licensing exam out there is the ASWB exam. But the compact is written broadly in order to kind of foresee into the future and give the compact some flexibility if other competency measures arose 20 years from now that the commission wanted to say, yeah, we approve that as being evidence of competence and somebody should be able to do this rather than the ASWB exam in order to use the compact. It's flexible to allow for that in the future. So we're not locking in one pathway forever. We're allowing the compact to be flexible, because if we ever wanted to change the compact statute in the future, it would have to be readopted by all of the member states and go through the legislative process all over again. And so we really don't want that to happen. We want to give the compact flexibility in order to change in the future without having to go and rewrite it and repass it through the legislature. So all this is saying is that if a social worker wants to use the compact, if they want to apply for a multi-state license, they have to pass the qualifying national exam, which the only exam out there currently is the ASWB exam. So for all intents and purposes, this is saying that a social worker who wants to use the compact now currently needs to pass the ASWB exam, while simultaneously allowing for flexibility in the future. Okay, number 4, required clinical category social workers complete a period of supervised clinical practice. So there's no specific hours amount with this particular requirement. So if your state requires 4,000 hours for your LCSWs, or 2,000 or 3,000, you're still eligible to join the compact. This is just saying, as a state, you have to require that clinical social workers have a period of supervised practice. So you can't get rid of that requirement completely and still join the compact. But in terms of the specific number of hours that your state has, that's not spoken to here in this section. Okay, these are ongoing obligations that the state has to fulfill in order to maintain their membership in the compact. So the state has to notify the commission of any discipline actions taken against a licensee. This is just kind of a fundamental component of being a participant in the compact. If you take an action on somebody's license, you got to let all the member states know that you took that action and share that information. Comply with the rules of the commission. So like I mentioned on the previous slide, the commission's going to write rules and regulations that govern the compact, and those regulations are binding on all the member states. You're agreeing to this contract, the commission governs the contract, so you have to agree with the terms and conditions of the contract. Number 3, implement procedures for a criminal background check. This is just saying, this is not saying that a state has to have a background check process in place right now for licensees. This is just saying, once you join the compact, on an ongoing basis for licensees who want to use the compact, you need to run background checks on those social workers who want a multi-state license. So if you're going to be working in multiple states, there's kind of a heightened public protection concern there. Other member states are going to want to know that this person doesn't have a significant criminal history. And so that's why we typically these compacts require a background check if you're going to be using the compact. And then lastly, participation in the data system. This is, again, how all the information sharing is done amongst the member states, is via a shared information system or shared data system. Okay, so getting into eligibility requirements for the social worker. So we're moving away from the requirements that the state has to have in place, and now we're talking about requirements that an individual social worker needs to fulfill. So number 1, the social worker has to complete what the compact calls a competency requirement, and that could be displayed through essentially 3 different avenues. Number 1, pass the qualifying national exam, which on the previous slide we said currently the only exam is the ASWB exam that would fit this definition. Number 2, period of continuous licensure for social workers licensed before the ASWB exam. So this was we had a lot of conversation in the drafting process about what happens if you're a social worker who's been licensed in good standing for 20 years. Your state has only required the ASWB exam for the last 10 years. are we really going to bar those social workers from potentially using the compact? And the answer is no. So if you have been licensed prior to your state adopting the ASWB exam and licensed continuously, then that would satisfy this competency requirement. And I'll note here, this is a shrinking population of people as we move farther into the future, and these types of social workers are phasing out of the profession, but there is still a population of social workers out there who predate the ASWB exam being a licensure requirement, and we don't want to prohibit those people from being able to use the compact. Substantial equivalent approved by the commission. So this is just, again, giving the commission flexibility to, in the future, if there was another competency assessment that arose, to be flexible and approve something that was deemed to be the substantial equivalent of any of these other competency measures. Number two, so that's number one, competency requirement. Number two, accredited social work degree. So again, this is MSW or higher for the master's and clinical level, BSW or higher for the bachelor's level. And then lastly, a practice requirement. This is for the clinical level only. So if you're a BSW or MSW, it's really just you fulfill the competency requirement that we talked about and you have an accredited social work degree. For the clinical social worker, the compact says 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised clinical practice or 2 years, or again, this substantial equivalent approved by the commission. So when we looked at the landscape, when we looked at the data from ASWB, 3,000 hours was pretty as much uniformity as we could find in terms of hours of postgraduate supervised clinical practice at that clinical license. So I'm sure Kara knows the number, but the majority of states are at least at 3,000 or 2 years. And so that's the kind of threshold that we set in the compact. It doesn't say that it has to be exactly 3,000. So if you're a state that requires 4,000, you exceed that 3,000, that would certainly satisfy this requirement here. Okay, other requirements. This is requirements for all social workers, regardless of category. So you have to, again, hold an active unencumbered license issued by your home state. So if your license is not unencumbered, if there is a current discipline action against your license or any kind of limitation on your license at all that would prohibit you from practicing to the full extent of your scope, then that would be considered an encumbered license. You wouldn't be eligible. So it has to be active and unencumbered. Number two, you pay all fees related to the application. This is typically the state sets whatever this fee is. It's their license that they're issuing, so the state retains control over what the fee is. Typically, it's going to be similar to the fee for a regular license, or maybe slightly higher because the social worker is receiving extra benefit by being able to practice in multiple states. Number three, complete continuing education requirements of the home state. So rather than having to complete CEs in every remote state where the social worker wants to practice, they only have to complete CE in their home state. So that's kind of all of this is contingent on you maintaining your home state license. As long as you're maintaining your home state license, your ability to use the compact continues and won't be prohibited. So you don't have to complete CEs in any remote states, just your home state. So again, thinking to those examples of a social worker who might currently hold 15 or 20 state licenses, the amount of work that would be eliminated by adopting the compact would be significant, particularly around cost and not having to complete all of these extra continuing education requirements. And then lastly, agree to abide by the laws, rules, and regulations of the state where the client is located. So this is kind of where scope of practice is dictated, is wherever the client is located when the time the services are rendered. So if I'm licensed by my home state of Kentucky, I'm practicing across the border in the state of Indiana. If I'm in Indiana, either via telepractice or in person, I have to abide by all of Indiana's laws and rules while I'm there. And if I violate the Indiana Practice Act, the Indiana board can come and take action against my authorization to practice in Indiana. So you have to abide by the laws regardless of where you're licensed. You have to abide by the laws where you are practicing. Okay, so just to kind of go through some of the remaining sections a little bit quicker. Section 5, I'll talk about on the next slide, but it essentially, no, sorry, I got mixed up there. So Section 5 essentially is providing some additional direction to the licensing boards about the issuance of a multi-state license. Because we're dealing with 3 categories of practice, there's a little bit of confusion around how do I actually administer this application process. So Section 5 gets into a little bit more detail there. Section 6 affirmatively just states all of the things that the member state licensing board retains control over. So their ability to issue a single state license to somebody, their licensing requirements, scope of practice, all those things still remain with the board, and the commission has no role in dictating any of that. Section 7, that's the next slide, deals with the scenario. So we've talked about how the compact facilitates multi-state practice, working in many states at one time. What if I actually want to move? What if I actually want to change my home state? Is there something in the compact that would help me? And so that's what Section 7 is all about, is essentially if you are moving between 2 compact member states, state A, your initial state, that multi-state license essentially expires, and the new home state issues their home state license, their new multi-state license, if you are actually changing your state of residence, your domicile. So you can only hold 1 multi-state license at a time. And if you're moving between states, there's a expedited process by which you can get a new home state license in that new state. Pending, I think it's pending a background check. So the new state runs a background check, and the new state can require a jurisprudence assessment over their Practice Act. But after that, they issue their multi-state license without the need for primary source verification. So you're not going to have to, supply a transcript or proof of licensure in the other state, or, track down your clinical supervisor and get their signature. Like you hear all these crazy stories about, I had to find my supervisor from grad school that I haven't talked to in 15 years. You won't have to do any of that. So it's a seamless process for you to get a new multi-state license if you are moving between compact member states. Okay, more remaining sections. So Section 8 is specific to active duty military and their spouses. So there are special provisions for active duty military spouses. Essentially says that if you are a active duty military member or a spouse, you can designate a home state and retain that home state designation throughout your active duty military service. So regardless of where you actually move, your home state stays the same for purposes of the compact. So if, let's say, for purposes of the compact, my home state is Georgia, I could move 10 times in the next 10 years. It would not matter. For purposes of the compact, my home state will always be Georgia. I won't ever lose access to the compact, because if Georgia's in it, Georgia's my home state. I'm always going to be able to use the compact regardless of where I actually move. Section 9 deals with adverse action. We'll talk about that on the next slide, but essentially this section talks about what does the home state have jurisdiction over, what does the remote state have jurisdiction over, and how does the adverse action process take place. Section 10 establishes the Compact Commission. So again, the commission is the governing body made up of all the member states, and we say that the commissioner, the person who is going to represent the state is going to be a representative of the state licensing authority or their designee. Typically, this is the board executive director or legal counsel to the board. Typically, it's not a board member because, you know, if you think about, most board members are active licensees. If you have a full caseload, you're a social worker, and you're trying to also fulfill your obligations as a commissioner, that could be very difficult. Whereas if you're board staff, it falls in line more seamlessly with your daily obligations and your daily duties as the executive director of the state board. So typically that's who we see filling these roles on the commission. Section 11 is the data system. It's the type of information that the data system will collect, availability of investigative information, adverse action, and licensure information. Okay, so I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit more about adverse action. I know we have a lot of representatives of licensing boards on the meeting. So how does a state actually take action on this multi-state license issued under the compact? So two scenarios I want to run through. The first one is if a social worker violates the Practice Act in their home state. So the home state will conduct the investigation. The home state takes an adverse action on the multi-state license. That action is then reported via the data system to all of the other remote states in the compact, and their ability to use the compact is automatically suspended. Because if you remember the requirements that we just went through, having an active unencumbered license is the #1 requirement. So if your license is no longer unencumbered, then you can't use the compact anymore. So essentially, if your home state takes an action on the multi-state license, you're automatically, you're done using the compact until that license is restored to good standing. Okay, so what happens if a social worker violates the Practice Act in a remote state? So that remote state where the action took place conducts the investigation. They report the presence of significant investigative information to the data system. They don't say anything about the investigative information because of due process rights for that licensee. And I know a lot of states have very strict requirements around due process and sharing of investigative information until it's fully adjudicated. So it's just the availability. It's the presence of investigative information. In the nursing compact, we call this the flag. So essentially a nurse, if they're under investigation in another state, their file in the nursing data system is flagged. All the other remote states know, okay, this nurse is under investigation in another state. So the remote state is then able to take an action on what we call the multi-state authorization to practice in their state. So again, let's use an example just to flesh this out a little bit more. My home state of Kentucky, I'm practicing in Indiana. I violate the Indiana Practice Act. Indiana takes action on my authorization to practice in Indiana. What they cannot do is take action on my multi-state license because they didn't issue that. Kentucky issued the multi-state license. So Indiana is going to report that they took an action on the authorization to practice in Indiana. They're going to report that to the data system. All the other member states will see that. They will see the investigatory file once it's finalized, and they will be able to take a reciprocal action if they deem it necessary. So the state, if it's not a big deal to the state, they could ignore it. If it's significant enough, they could say, well, we don't want this person practicing in our state, so we're going to take action against our authorization to practice that this social worker has. And then lastly, the home state will be able to review the same information and deem whether or not an action is necessary on the multi-state license itself, which again would suspend the ability to use the compact entirely. Okay, these are the last few sections here. So rulemaking, I've mentioned the commission's going to have the ability to write rules. This just helps the compact function and be implemented and administered without having to go in and rewrite the compact and have it repassed in the legislature. Just as with any other legal agreement, there's a dispute resolution process. If the parties of the agreement can't if there's an individual who is not holding up their end of the bargain, or they're out of compliance in the terms of the agreement, there's a dispute resolution process to bring the problem child back into compliance with the terms of the agreement. Section 14 is the effective date. So we say that the compact is going to come into effect when it's enacted by the 7th member state. So that's kind of the threshold that we are looking to hit, is the compact being passed by 7 states. Until we actually hit 7 states, we're just kind of in this limbo period. States are passing the compact, but none of this is actually in effect yet until we hit 7 states. There's also withdrawal and amendment provisions. So just like with any other contract, you can withdraw from it, and the parties can amend it collectively if they chose to do so. Section 15 deals with severability. So again, the members of the contract can collectively sever it if they chose to do so. And then lastly, the binding effect of compact and other laws. This is just saying that if the compact conflicts with any existing state law, that the compact would supersede wherever there's a conflict. So people hear state laws being conflicted and alarm bells start ringing, but I just want to emphasize that this is pretty rare for there to be direct conflicts with the compact, because, you know, if you remember, if you think about, this is just a alternative optional pathway to practice. The state's single state licensing process still remains untouched. Scope of practice remains untouched. So because we're just creating a new pathway, it's very rare for there actually to be conflicts. So where you see conflicts are things around, rulemaking procedures, or public notice of meetings, things like that, where there might be a conflict with what the state currently requires versus what the compact requires. But the core elements of social work practice, there should be no conflict with the compact. Okay, so we'll wrap this up and just talk about where we're at currently in terms of legislation. So this is where the states that have introduced so far in 2023. So you can see our one state to enact the compact this year was the state of Missouri. Shout out to NASW Missouri, who played a pivotal role in that legislation getting enacted. We have pending bills in Ohio and New Jersey currently. You see North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia on there as well. These bills were introduced this year, but will carry over to next year. So they're pending on here, but there's no intent to actually move these during 2023 because all of these legislative sessions have ended, but those bills will likely roll over to next year. So I think we could get up to potentially 3 states if New Jersey passes. I think Ohio has passed the Senate, waiting for introduction in the House. So looking pretty promising in Ohio as well to be our second state. Okay, so here is just a table of the same information essentially. You can see the states where the compact was not enacted this year. And again, the number we're trying to hit is 7. So once we hit 7 member states, that's when all of this will go into effect. Okay, so potential 2024 compact member states. So besides the states that you saw on the map, I think, if a state introduced the compact in 2023 and was not successful, pretty decent chance that they'll probably try again in 2024. But some other potential 2024 states. So CSG administered a survey to social work boards and also NASW state chapters, and essentially just asked whether or not they were interested in introducing the compact during the next legislative session. And you can see all the states here who responded and said yes, that they are interested and are looking to introduce the compact next year. And you can see where that interest is coming from, particularly if it's coming from the board or the NASW chapter. I know there's a lot of boards that are prohibited from getting involved in legislation or direct advocacy efforts, but there are some boards who are authorized to do that and can take the lead on legislation. So you can see some of those boards here. All right, so with that, I will wrap up. And I know we have been on for a while so far, so we want to give you everybody a break. We're kind of at the halfway point of the meeting, so we'll give everybody 10 minutes. Stretch, get a drink of water, use the restroom, and we'll come back. I have 2:08 Eastern time on my watch, so we'll reconvene at 2:18 and we'll jump back into our next session. So again, encourage everybody. That was a lot of information, I'm sure. So ask your questions in the chat, and we have a agenda item dedicated to Q&A later in the meeting to answer all of your questions. So thank you all, and we will see you again in about 10 minutes.
All right, everyone. I've got 2:18 on my watch, so we're gonna bring everyone back in and go on to the next section of our presentation today, which will be our Compact Perspective panel. And we are very glad to have two great guests today participating in today's panel. Our first is Anika Hunt from NASW Utah, and then Daryl Spinks from the Texas Behavioral Health Executive Council. And I will go ahead and let them introduce each other, starting with Anika.
Good morning. Can I get a comm check?
Yep, we've got you.
That's fantastic. So my name is Annika Hunt. I am a licensed clinical social worker by practice. I have been in the field of social work for over 20 years. And I am the current president-elect of the Utah NASW chapter. I am really enjoying this webinar so far. My current field of practice actually as a social worker is military social work. And so when I hear from our DoD partners, I'm really encouraged that, part of our motivation is taking care of military families. So that's who I am. I'll turn it over to my other partner.
Daryl, go ahead.
Thank you all. I really appreciate the council giving us the opportunity, Annika and I, the opportunity to speak here, and everybody kind of taking the time out of their day to join us. My name is Daryl Spinks. I'm the executive director for the Texas Behavioral Health Executive Council. It's a mouthful. We just call it BHEC. We have jurisdiction over the social work board, psychology, marriage and family therapy, and counseling boards here in Texas. And somehow or another, Grant and Matt roped me into doing this today. So if there's any gripes or complaints, send them to Matt Schaefer. His email address will be provided at a later time.
Thank you for that intro, Annika and Daryl, and making sure everyone knows where they can go to with their complaints. We appreciate that. We missed that now. So thank you, Daryl. So we've got a few questions for our panel today. A few questions which kind of span between differentiate a bit based on both of your all's kind of perspectives and backgrounds. So the questions will be a little different for both of you, but our first one, we will start off as a question for both of you. And Daryl, we will go ahead and start with you. What benefit do you think the social work compact will provide to your state?
I think it's I've got down here on my list about 3 or 4 things just off the top of my head that it's going to benefit Texas. First and foremost, I'll say I'm not a social worker. I'm an attorney, did litigation work before I came to work for the state. And so I kind of, and as a managing partner of a firm, so I kind of come at it from more of I look at it almost as from a business perspective. And I don't mean this to sound cold, but I also look at mental health providers, behavioral health providers like social workers as assets. How can we field enough assets to meet the needs of our citizenry? And so one of the big boons to a compact is it simply increases the number of eligible providers you have at your disposal to meet your population's needs. We have performed in Texas, we have performed several studies now trying to figure out what's causing the workforce shortage, what can we do to ameliorate that shortage. And what you see time and again is that the results come up with, number one, we can't mint enough providers we can't mint our way out of this problem. And 2, you can't import your way out of the problem. So what does that tell you? If you can't mint them and you can't import your way out, what have you got to do? It means you got to get better with working with what you have. To quote Colonel Roosevelt, you got to do what you can with what you have where you're at. And that's really what a compact is. It's not a perfect tool. It's not a silver bullet. But it is a very powerful tool that allows you to maximize the resources you have available to you. And, 2, it also creates expanded opportunity for your licensees. One of the great things about compacts that licensure by endorsement and maybe reciprocity, well, some degree reciprocity, but licensure by endorsement methodologies don't offer is a two-way street. If I do licensure by endorsement, folks from Arkansas and Missouri can come into Texas, but it doesn't help my folks go into those jurisdictions. And again, I'm looking at you as assets, and I don't mean that to sound cold, or disconnected, but you are an asset, but you're also a small businessman and a small businesswoman. And you may have a heart of gold, but you got a mortgage and you got an empty belly at the end of the month if you don't have anything to, pay those things. So, I think we also need to recognize that compacts allow licensed providers to expand their revenue streams, their revenue potentials. I don't know why we shouldn't be looking at that if we can do that in a way that doesn't jeopardize public health and protection. And I think compacts are an excellent way to do that. And with that, I'll turn that over to Annika.
Yeah, I mean, everything that's been talked about so far, right? It expands opportunities, it expands access to client population, it diversifies specialization, it does all of those things. But, I think about, what unique perspective do I have to offer? Utah is a Western state. We are an interesting geographic disbursement. We have a large corridor of population, and we have vast unpopulated and rural areas, right? So in addition to bringing more people into the community that could potentially serve Utahns, we're talking about, if you are a Utahn, it expands your opportunity to have a viable social work career. And, the other thing that I think it does is that it makes social work more desirable as a career field. We have to think about, it's not just what I need right now, but, what about 10 years from now? What about when I will need a social worker at a different point in my life, right? Will there be people to care for me? And so, we do have to have some thought of, is this a profession that is desirable? It's viable, right? Because I worry about social workers having empty bellies at the end of the month. And so if it expands opportunities to have a viable career, social work is an interesting profession because our profession actually has gotten more diverse and more expanded as social problems start to kind of be reconceptualized. We're talking about library social work is now a specialization. Public health or public safety social work is a new specialization. And so, we're growing and expanding, and we need to really look at the idea that we have to be able to be mobile, either technologically mobile or even physically mobile across different communities. So, I think about my state, there's some projections in my state that we're going to need upwards of 4,000 more therapists in the next couple of years to support the mental health demand. And we do have to think about, how do we care for the vulnerable populations we've pledged to as social workers? Part of that really has to look like, how do we create public policies that regulate our profession, that make our profession a desirable career?
Thank you so much for that, Annika and Daryl. That first question, going on to our next question, Daryl, you had mentioned a lot of the work you do alongside other mental health professions in Texas. As far as some of those professions and compacts, can you talk a little bit about your experience as a regulator working with other compacts that have already become operational? How do these compacts make your job as a regulator a little easier, and then maybe address some of the challenges as well?
Sure, be happy to. Right now, the only compact we have that's operational is SIPAC, the psychology licensure compact. And I remember the good thing about sitting through that compact, making it through the legislature, and then discussions on this one and the counseling compact. You hear a lot of the same arguments. It's rinse and repeat a lot of times whenever you're talking about why you shouldn't do a compact. It's it's going to undermine the state's authority. You're going to cut into state sovereignty. It's going to increase more work on staff load. None of that has been my experience with SIPAC. I got to tell you, as far as SIPAC goes, it's once you turn the key on and you start it, you can pretty much step away because it's on autopilot. SIPAC has, I think we joined it in 2019. We haven't had a single complaint. Now, it's telepsychology only and temporary in-person only. Very few people do the temporary in-person. Almost everybody does the telepsychology component of it. So you really only have a couple hundred at one time that are doing in-person compact practice throughout the country. But we've had 0 complaints out of that. And quite frankly, that mirrors a lot of what we're seeing just in telehealth practice in our the internal numbers in Texas. We don't get a lot of complaints that arise out of telepractice. We have not been burdened. You hear a lot of people worried about, okay, is this going to make it more difficult for my staff because we're already strapped? I mean, we're a state agency, just like many of you on this call. I get it. They never give us the manpower we need. We're chronically underfunded. They're always, the legislatures, from a good point, I mean, a good place in the heart oftentimes, but they're oftentimes putting more mandates on us, and they don't necessarily back it up with the funding that the agencies need. So more and more is heaped on you, and they just expect you to do more and more with what you have. But I've never felt like SIPAC was a burden or it was weighing us down. My GC handles it. He serves as the commissioner on SIPAC. I've never had him come to me and go, "That's it, I've had it. I'm leaving the office," and him leaving a tizzy. You just don't see that. It functions very well. Now, I'll tell you one of the key things that I've learned both in running this agency and in watching SIPAC. One key is you got to set it up. You got to set it up and hire good staff to run it. So that's something important for this commission to keep in mind whenever it's being set up. Make sure you hire good people, that you hire enough, and that you build the resources that you're going to need, not just for at that time, but with a kind of a forward-thinking approach. Build towards an expanded future, because you're going to have, once this ball starts to roll, I think this is going to start snowballing pretty quick. You got to have 7 to start the commission here, but I think it's going to snowball very quickly once this thing starts. And so just kind of keep those things in mind, kind of build with an eye toward the future. A lot of the worries, the problems, and the naysayers that are out there, none of that stuff happened with SIPAC, none of it. And I will add this, and I meant to say it in the first question. I will say that I think compacts are an excellent return on investment. For example, SIPAC costs us $6,000 a year to participate in that. In exchange for that, I now have more licensed psychologists eligible to deliver services in Texas than what I have licensed in Texas. That is a very good return on your investment. Now, some people may say, well, yeah, Daryl, but they're not all practicing. No, but they couldn't do it before. And now we've created the opportunity. And this is one of those compacts are one of those things that it gives government a chance to really get ahead of something and say, we're going to get out of the way this time, instead of being, the anchor that's kind of holding progress back. We're going to step aside and create this expanded opportunity for people. So, I think that's something we all need to look at when deciding whether we want to do it, whether your particular state wants to do it. But SIPAC hasn't been any problem. I mean, candidly, Grant, the fact that I don't have anything negative to say about SIPAC is probably the best testimony I can give for the effectiveness and the efficacy of compacts. I just don't have anything bad to tell y'all. I don't know of any other states that have had bad experiences in SIPAC, just in talking with them. So if somebody out there has, I'd be curious to hear about it. If you don't want to say it publicly, then just give me a call or shoot me an email. But it just has not been our experience. It's actually been a very pleasant experience. It's easy to do. The commission keeps it off of our back. We don't have to deal with it. It's just running in the background, if you will. So just 0 problems.
Thank you for that, Daryl. Good to hear your perspective with other compacts, especially SIPAC. She'll have a good amount of similarities here to social work compact and mental health professions. Go on to our next question, Veronica. Access to social work services. People's ability to access good qualified social workers is a key issue that we keep hearing, keeps getting brought up in the conversations around the compact. Can you talk about any issues for access to care for individuals in Utah? And how the compact may alleviate some of those issues?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, there's projections, Utah is a state that grew exponentially in the past 3 years, maybe 4 or 5. And our population growth did not our infrastructure did not keep pace with the amount of people coming to our state. And, I think, again, like you have to think about these systems of care and are they equipped to handle the new population? Again, sort of this boom bust cycle of the West, right? Like, and I'm always thinking about that. And so, we don't have enough people now, and we won't have enough people for a while to take care of not just the mental health needs, but, the overall psychosocial and broad spectrum of things that social workers help with. We are not just mental health providers doing therapy. Again, like I mentioned, like the diversification of social work settings is growing, and we don't have enough people to do that. The agency that I work in has 2 LCSW positions open that they're struggling to fill, and these used to be really great paying jobs, really great situations, but because the labor market has outpaced other agencies, like we see just positions unfilled. And, I think that it goes back to, again, what I was saying is that there's the geographic distribution of Utah, the exponential growth, the lack of infrastructure growth along with that. So, one of the things, I'll tell a story about one of our board members and the practice setting that they work in. They work in a large sort of regionalized healthcare system in a somewhat specialized medical setting for, specialty diagnoses and whatnot. And, in the West, right, like we have this Intermountain West concept of where Salt Lake City is located. We draw from southern Idaho, we draw from large parts of Wyoming, we draw from northwest Colorado, we draw from the entire northern part of Nevada. And so, we have this regional idea, right? Well, because these patients or clients go home, can we follow them and deliver telehealth or enhanced services to these people? They live in another state, they're getting their care from a regional health system. And, because there isn't interstate compact licensure or reciprocity, so it would be incumbent upon those people to maintain licenses in multiple states in the Intermountain West. Like, how viable is that really? It's not very viable. So these patients, these clients, do we burden them to come back geographically? Do we say you go without? And so I think that there are so many examples of things like that. We have a mobile population. What if they live here for part of the year and go home for part of the year? We have a mobile workforce. They need support, they need care, and they need to be engaged in systems of care. We have not kept up with how the population has changed in lifestyle, in access to resources, into where they live, what they need, and they're changing. It's a very dynamic population. And, I'm not sure our regulation has really kept pace with that. Granted, this is a very complex system or complex proposition that we're talking about with interstate compact licensure. But again, I think access to care is really significant, just because life in America has changed, and what people need, and the other significant cultural change is people's willingness to seek help, and people's willingness to engage in the type of care that social workers provide. And, we're still working on a system of service delivery that really is based on an older way of how people approached getting their needs met. So that's a little bit generic, but I mean, I can really talk about, again, our geography changes things. Our economic development has changed rapidly, right? And, how are we keeping pace with that? So, my husband and I kind of make this joke where we say, Utah is full, don't come here, right? Because we've grown so quickly. The pace of life, the cost of living, all of those things has changed. And, can we attract new professionals, existing professionals to come work here? I'm in a situation professionally where I am trying to recruit to fill positions. And, that's a bit of a challenge and a barrier, because we have to say, not only are your relocation things barriers, right? But now potentially licensure could be a barrier because maybe you're licensed here and the reciprocity doesn't align perfectly well, right? I think a compact really does remove some of those barriers for people to move. Again, and we work with a lot of students. I work with a lot of students with my work with NASW and, talking with them about, is this a good career? But, if you're tied to the land that licenses you, that might not be as desirable of a career. And so that's come up in our past year with NASW and supporting our student members is this idea of portability. And, they're saying, I went into this career with these expectations that my lifestyle would be able to mirror that of other Americans and other professionals of life in America. And what you're telling me is that's not true. And I say, well, right now it's not true. And so, again, how do we attract more people long-term to the community? But right now we need people like right now. And because our profession is diversifying, our profession is growing exponentially, but our delivery of services really hasn't kept up with demand and way people want to consume social work services and benefit from social work.
Thank you so much for that, Annika, and that kind of to help people get a grasp of sort of the impact that compacts can have, and what social work issues and addressing needs can feel like in your state. And I'm sure there's many people out there who can relate in their state as well. Certainly. So moving on to the next question for Daryl. Daryl, we were fortunate enough to have you on our project team that helped to put the final document together. Can you talk a little bit about your experience being involved with that group, and then maybe even some of the challenges that group faced in putting the compact together?
Yeah, one of the, I guess probably one of the first things that kind of hit me in the face whenever we kind of launched those project team meetings was, like psychology, social work there's not just one license. It's not a homogeneous license. You've got 3 different license types. You got your bachelor's, master's, and clinical level. That, if you're just drafting a compact for one, I say this is, it's very dismissive. If you're just drafting a compact for one license type, oh, it's easy peasy. Matt's going to shoot daggers at me through the chat function here in a minute, but it is easier than doing it for 3 license types, especially when not all jurisdictions license all 3 of those. And you have to build a compact. It really, from my perspective, in Texas, we license all 3. It would not be fair for Texas for me to have gone in there and said, well, I'm willing to jettison the LBSWs and the MSWs just to get a compact for the LCSWs. I mean, I've got some of my folks from Texas on here. They'd have thrown rocks at me the first time I made it back to Texas. So that was really not an option for us. So when we went in there, my objective was I wanted to try to secure a compact that allowed for licensure portability for all 3 levels of licensure. It was a real challenge trying to figure out how to do that, especially for the states that don't license those. That's one of those moments where you see people lean back in their chair with their fingers in their hair, and you're really trying to figure it out. I mean, those were the scenes in some of those drafting team meetings. So that was probably one of the bigger challenges. Another thing that I worried about anytime you go into a project this big is the level of bureaucracy and administration it can take to run something like this can become so big so quickly that you begin to lose the efficiencies that you need to sell it at the legislative level and for it to actually work, to be honest with you. And so, one of the things I wanted to make sure is we didn't come up with a bureaucracy, and that's not a dirty word. A lot of people use it as a dirty word. It's just a very realistic term. The administrative bureaucracy, you've got to have something like that to run this, the commission. I just wanted to make sure that we set it up in a way that it would work. And when you say that, well, what does that mean, Daryl? That means you got to be able to set it up so that it can talk to and work with. We use Tyler Tech Versa database here. Your jurisdiction may not. You may use one of the 15 or 20 other databases out there, or you may have your own custom database. You may have a process that goes this way, or you may have a strict confidentiality statute. You got to sit down and just really, there's no easy way to do it. You just got to sit down and hash all that out. And that's where really having like CSG in the mix helps, because 9 times out of 10, they'd already run into this question or the issue before, and we're able to pull from, well, how did nursing do it? How did PTOT do it? How are their statutes or rules in general align with or that differ from ours? So to me, that was the most difficult part, the most challenging part of it is, 3 levels of licensure, 3 different scopes of practice. How do you do that when not everybody has that? Then making sure that the commission that you create can actually function and talk to all of us, because it's going to be requesting information from us. We're going to be asking for information from it. And I really don't need to get gibberish from the commission if I'm trying to figure out, did one of my guys do something naughty over in Virginia? I need to be able to understand what they did, or just something along those lines. It's got to be workable and usable, and I don't need it to take up a ton of my time because I don't have the time to devote to it. Because like I said before, SIPAC, I now have more LPs eligible to practice in Texas than what I am licensing myself. My staff are based upon the workload of the folks we license, not 2 times that number. So we've got to build that commission at such a high degree of efficiency that it can handle that for us. And then it's not constantly gnawing at us, pestering us to death for information and data. They got to be able to operate almost independently, or at least run in the background is kind of the way I describe it. So those were the big challenges that I saw, Grant, whenever we were meeting. I'll just say this, I feel very good with the work product that came out of that. I'm very pleased with it. A lot of, like I say, a lot of finger through the hair moments there. It wasn't always easy conversations, but it really shouldn't be. That's, if you're a policy wonk or a legal nerd, those types of things are fun. It does get interesting because you really get into some true debates in those types of meetings, and you don't get to see that very often anymore. But I thought that part of it was pretty cool. But I'm nerding out on you now. That's really it, Grant. That's all on that.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl, and thank you for your help during that process, or that portion of the process of the social work compact and rolling it out. But as we move into now the compact being developed, transitioning into a new phase, which is getting the legislation passed in states across the country with. And Annika, a lot of that onus falls on the NASW chapters like the one you lead in Utah. Can you talk about your experience somewhat with the legislative process in Utah this year regarding the social work compact? Any arguments that were impactful for legislators and maybe some important stakeholders, or any points of the compact that maybe caused some of those stakeholders or legislators any concern?
Yeah. So just a shout out to Daryl that we should sit by each other, because I'm also one of those policy wonk nerds. I didn't start that way, but it was my work with this policy stuff over the past 3 years with NASW that kind of created this dysfunctional hobby, right? And that's what I call it. It's my dysfunctional hobby of reading prospective legislation. So let me just you saw a slide during Matt Schaefer's presentation about the states and kind of what their status was. And I actually have a bone to pick with you, Matt Schaefer, because our legislation didn't fail. It just didn't pass, right? So it wasn't voted against. It wasn't voted on at all. And the timeline is actually why. So in the state of Utah, our legislative session is once a year primarily, and it goes kind of from January to sort of the middle end of February. It's fast, it's quick and dirty, and to somebody who's not in the policy world or the politics world, which a lot of social workers aren't, frankly, a lot of clinical professionals aren't, or our emphasis is on other things, but it can be very confounding and opaque and scary. And so our legislature, we have some very strong supporters of compact legislation. Utah is SIPAC member. Utah adopted occupational therapy. Utah adopted the counseling compact. So we have a good legislative precedent for supporting compact. Our legislative session ended 1 week after Council on State Governments released its model legislation, its finalized model legislation. We simply ran out of time. And we actually had, so we have a bicameral legislature, a Senate and a Congress or a legislator in our state. And we had bills filed in both bodies, prospective bills. Those bills kind of didn't make it into committee yet because, again, we ran out of time. We are very confident that we're going to get support for passing compact legislation in the state of Utah in January, February of 2024. And we're really excited about it. It's kind of the top legislative priority for the Utah chapter of NASW. But we actually have a lot of work to do before then. And, we haven't heard any significant arguments against compact legislation, either from our legislative supporters or detractors or our members. But, that's the process. There's a question a little bit later on that's going to talk about, what is the call to action? Like, how do we move forward? But one of the things that I think is really, really important that happened in the Utah legislative process, because we did have a legislative member who was very supportive of compact legislation, had a bill file open as a placeholder bill with sort of the preliminary legislative language in that bill that had not yet been finalized. And the intent was to never pass that old language. The intent was to keep a place open and update that bill through the review process with the current updated language. Again, finalized language came out 1 week before the session ended, and we ran out of time. And that's okay, right? Like that was okay. I'm very proud of my home state, and that's why I want you to fix your slide, Matt. That we just didn't pass it because it didn't have its opportunity to make its way through the legislative process. But to my knowledge, there really wasn't any strong opposition to it, again, because our state, we are a red state politically. This is a political process. This is a political issue. We're talking about the human rights of access to care and social justice and things like that. But there is a political this is a political process that gets these compacts passed in states. And, my state cares very much about jobs. They care very much about, this expanded population that came here. We care very much about quality of life. We care a lot about the unmet mental health needs of the population, particularly our kids, which is a problem. Utah right now is number 10 in the nation for completed or for deaths by suicide. So, we need help. And I think most of our legislators and political supporters really realize that removing access to care barriers is a top priority. Now, they don't always vote that way when funding is concerned, but they do usually vote that way if it expands commerce. And so that's, like Daryl was talking about, like there is an economics to this that we would be naive to not understand, know, and be able to talk about. But, we want this to be meet the needs of the population. But also we want people who want to live and work here be able to make a good, decent quality of life living doing this type of work. And so, that's usually how we come at it. Again, politically and ideologically, coming at it from a social justice perspective might not be effective for the political landscape of our state. But if we look at it and we say, this is an economic issue, and we need to see it as such that we expand access and we keep a healthier state population by having great mental health providers, social work providers, to meet the needs of our very rapidly growing state. So that's kind of an answer. I'm kind of excited to talk about like what's next, because I've been looking at some of the chat, and your apologies accepted, sir. I see your comment about kind of what next, like what's the call to action. And I have a lot of really good ideas I want to share with the webinar participants today. So thanks for the question.
Thank you so much, Annika. And
Oh, there's one question. Let
Go
me
ahead.
let me answer Kimberly's question. She kept saying, what do you mean by expanded population? So earlier I referred to the population growth in the state of Utah. A lot of people have moved here. It's put pressure on housing, it's put pressure on healthcare infrastructure, it's put pressure on all kinds of things. This is a very desirable place to live. It's a very beautiful, great state, great community. But we really saw an uptick in our population growth, particularly during the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Annika, for addressing those questions. You brought up a good point. I just want to address real quick, and Daryl had mentioned earlier the meticulous work of the project team to make sure the end product was the right piece of legislation. And with that, it took a little bit longer to finalize, but the work of the NASW chapters and people on the ground with limited time to just get it on the table in the legislature in a good amount of states this year is really impressive. And we appreciate the work you did in Utah, and then the work people have done across other states, even with a little bit shorter time frame than was originally expected. But we definitely look ahead positively to 2024. Transitioning on to our next question for Daryl. As a regulator, protecting public health and safety is your main objective. Talk a little bit about how the Social Work Compact ensures the standards of quality and safety are well maintained.
One of the things I'm going to share here is it's something that I tell all my board members and council members whenever I'm doing like new board member training is, yes, our mission is to protect the public, but you got to keep in mind that there are multiple tools in your toolbox that you have that you can do that with. I think most people, when they get on a board or they participate in a regulatory agency like BHEC or one of yours, they instantly think of the licensing criteria. What can we do to keep the ne'er-do-wells and the bad actors out of the clubhouse to begin with? And they put all the emphasis on that. And everybody forgets about the enforcement function, the stick, if you will, that you have as a regulator. And so one of the things I think it's important is, because you'll hear the argument whenever compacts are being debated is, oh, well, we're lessening standards. Okay, you're going to hear that, I promise you. And I think it's important to remember that if you join a compact, that is your legislature saying, we are pledging that our licensing standards and your licensing standards are basically so close in nature that they provide the same amount of public protection, and we are going to trust a sister state in vetting those individuals. But that may satisfy some. It satisfies people like me, but I recognize I'm not everybody, and there's going to be some people that say, well, yeah, but you still have somebody coming in that may not meet all of Texas's standards to a T. It's true, but guess what? They still have to comply to a T to all our standard of care practices under the compact. They don't get to. So if you come from a Terrasoft state and you come into Texas and say, well, I should have the ability to breach confidence and tell these things, I'm like, no, you don't. I'm sorry. You have to comply with our standards of care set by our legislature here. So it's important for people to realize that while you may view, we may be giving up something a little bit they may not meet our standards to a T, you are not giving up another key component to your regulatory toolbox, and that is the enforcement mechanisms, your standard of care. You can still hold them. They are still held to the exact same standard that the licensees you meant are held to. So there really should be no difference in the standard of care given. I think that's something that's important, and I don't hear a lot of people talk about oftentimes. So that's something that I always try to remind folks of. I also think, and this goes back to a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, public health and safety is more than just protecting people from bad providers. Are you really protecting the public health and safety when you don't have anybody that can deliver services to somebody? I mean, if somebody's suicidal, have you really done them any favors by saying, well, you only had 2,000 of hours of supervised experience, therefore you can't come in. And that person wasn't able to access a provider that might have saved their life. Now, I realize that's an extreme example, and I probably shouldn't be using those types of extreme examples, but it kind of drives home the point of part of our job, whether we like to admit it or not, is the legislature builds us and hires us to field providers. We are the ones that grant a monopoly to practice in our jurisdictions in these fields, and the legislature has tasked us with doing it. So shouldn't we maximize the minting or the production of providers to the greatest extent possible? I think that while that may not be the traditional view of protecting public health and safety, in my mind, it very much fits into that description of public health and safety. So I've always viewed it that if I can pump out more providers that meet the standards set by the legislature, then it's my job to do it. And the compact gives me a way to do that. And so, that's just something that's just Daryl talking, I realize, but that's just something that's kind of the approach that I've taken to compacts in the past. Because I can't say that, everybody that comes into Texas under SIPAC would meet our standards. And I know that not everybody from Texas practicing under compact meets, say, Georgia's standards. And yet, like I said, we've never had a complaint. So that's pretty good evidence that, public health and safety is being protected by that compact and by the Georgia's standard of care, our standard of care, our licensing criteria. So I would just, to me, that's always been an important fact.
Thank you, Daryl, for that. And just giving your perspective today from a regulatory sense, we really appreciate it. We'll one more question for Annika as we wrap up our panel here. As you're well aware, state associations are really the crucial kind of cog in the machine of advocacy efforts along, for interstate compact specifically, for this compact especially. With a number of NASW chapters represented here in the meeting, and we're glad to have you all here today. What advice would you give to some of those state chapters or licensed social workers themselves who would want to advocate for the social work compact in their state? Yes,
I am ready. And this is the call to action I'm issuing in my own state, to my own peers, to my own colleagues. So, I detailed a little bit about our recent history this calendar year with our legislative session. What I would say to my chapter partners in NASW is to really think about what your chapter makeup, like your leadership and your boards and all of those things. What is your stance as a chapter, right? Because a lot of times in legislative work, like we kind of get hit and we get caught sideways about a particular issue we haven't researched, we haven't learned about. Learn as much as you can collectively about this compact. Read it. Understand what it is, because actually what I've learned is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what compacts are. I was in a group chat with a bunch of other social workers across the country, and one of them was frustrated about something. And she's like, when are we getting national licensure? And I said, probably never. But compact legislation is around the corner for a lot of states. Make sure that your state is on board with that. Again, I think we get very excited about the idea of not being constrained by our state borders and those regulations. And I worry that, social workers might go a little crazy with thinking, oh, good, Utah passed the compact legislation. That means I can go anywhere and do telehealth, right? No. So education is a really big piece of this, like understanding what compact legislation is, looking at our other professions about how did it go for that. Daryl's talked a lot about, SIPAC and how that's been, realistic timelines about how many states need to opt into compact. What will the timeline be before your state is issuing compact licenses? What that state compact license allows you to do. And what it doesn't allow you to do. So as chapters, we really carry a lot of gravitas with our name as a trade association and advocates for the practice of social work. We need to be providing our members practical, accessible information about what compact legislation is and what it says. Again, Daryl and I are the nerds who like to probably read policies and laws and prospective legislation and things like that. Help your members, because not everybody is that way, right? So make it manageable in your communication strategy and in your legislative strategy. Start now if you haven't already started, because if compact legislation is really not on the landscape for your state this year, it might be in following years, right? So being competent about what it entails and what the Council of State Governments has provided us as tools. There are, there's a one-sheeter, the model legislation, there's a lot on the CSG website that your chapters can use. Please use them. So that's a call to action to NASW chapters. You carry a lot of weight. Develop a strategy now. Vote on whatever you need to vote on for understanding what the direction you want to take your chapter. National level NASW has been very supportive, and they were critical in the development of the Social Work Compact model legislation. So here is my call to action to everyone else on the webinar, my fellow social workers. Read this legislation. Read it. Understand what it is. Understand what it is not. And once you digest that, once you Google, what does this mean? Or, you call a friend, or you talk to somebody at NASW about like, what exactly does that mean? Get a good understanding of it. And then you need to identify yourself to your elected official at your state, or multiple ones, depending on your state. And you need to identify yourself as a practicing social worker with an opinion about this compact legislation. Do it now. Don't wait till the session. Don't wait till the legislative session is on. Do it now. You say, I am a social worker and I vote. I think that we look to our professional associations for a lot of advocacy, and we forget about our individual agency and our individual advocacy as professionals. Do it where you live and where you vote. Do it where you practice, because your business matters to that district. Talk to multiple legislators, send them an email, and then call them. Because emails can be easy. I would advise against automated emails. We know that legislators don't really pay attention to those very much. They pay attention to personal emails, and they definitely pay attention to phone calls. So call them. Make time and call them and say, I've looked at this compact legislation. I think it would be very beneficial to me as a practicing social worker in this district. I would like your support and your opinion about the likelihood of passing compact legislation in my state. Be direct. Say, this will help me. This will help our residents. This will help your constituents. This is important for our state. And be direct about that. Again, it can be scary. It can be opaque to embrace the political process, but the only way to do it is to be bold and to be brave, and just start somewhere. Don't wait for NISW, frankly, and I've been saying that in our chapter, where I think we've had a lot of kind of members say, well, what are we doing about this? So I'm like, well, we're doing a lot about this, but there's one big voice and there's many small voices, and we actually need both groups to really weigh in and say, this is really important. This is important for the profession, and it's really, really important to the people that social work serve. And, again, if you can't do it for your own self-interests, do it for your clients. And say, this could really be beneficial because my agency hasn't been able to fill these 3 positions, and we really need a broader talent pool. Hey, I need to be able to practice across, our state border with our neighbor town, or, whatever. We need to make this really viable and really approachable for all social workers. And so, if you're in a chapter leadership, really think about that, making sure your members and even your non-members have access to digestible information about what compact is. Use CSG's tools that they've developed for us. And the call to action is, do not wait until you think your voice is ready to be heard. Your voice is ready to be heard right now, and you need to make it be heard. So, Susan says another way to be bold and brave is to run for your state legislature and advocate from within. I love you, Susan Ruiz. I don't even know you, right? I don't think we have enough social workers and elected official in elected positions. My state, I said we're very commerce friendly, right? We have a lot of property developers in our state legislature and business people. We don't have enough doctors, scientists, social workers, and teachers. So that's my personal politics coming out. Please forgive me. But this was a social work webinar, so you probably are not that surprised. But be bold and do it now, right? Read up. Get smart about it, understand how it's going to affect you, even positively. You know what? It might affect you negatively. You need to communicate to your chapter and say, this is going to hurt me. This is going to take business away from me, and enter into a dialogue with your community of practice and really weigh that out if that's true or not, and how that can be managed. I actually am not sure that's very true at all, although it might be in certain pockets of practice and certain pockets of geography. But I think, again, a rising tide raises all boats. And I think this is the rising tide we need.
Well, Annika, Daryl, we really appreciate you all being here today and giving your perspectives on the social work compact, both from a regulatory and then a practitioner standpoint. A little later on, to carry on what Annika discussed, and we're going to talk about some tips and tricks when you're advocating for your legislature. But before that, we're going to address some myths and common questions that we've had, throughout this process, and then in our vibrant chat discussion as well. And to address some of the myths that we've heard through this process, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. So I'm just going to run through these really quickly. I know there's been a lot of great questions in the chat, and we've got about 50 minutes left in our meeting, and I want to make sure everybody gets out on time. So just a couple of things that we have heard as we've been developing the compact that might be misconceptions about how it works or what it actually is. So first myth here, social work compact creates a national license for social workers. Annika touched on this point. The compact is not a national license. It's just a additional pathway to obtaining a state license that allows you to practice in multiple states. So it's not as if this is some sort of super license with a one single scope of practice attached to it. Each state retains jurisdiction over that license that they've issued. And like Daryl has said, and like I mentioned in my previous presentation, the state retains control over the Practice Act in what social workers are allowed to do within their borders. So this is not a national license. By joining the compact, I'm delegating my regulatory authority over to the commission. So again, as has been mentioned, licensing requirements stay the same. Your state's ability to issue a single state license stays the same, and your scope of practice stays the same. So really, you're not delegating anything over to the commission other than your ability to unilaterally deny someone from practicing in your state that otherwise meets all the requirements of the compact. So to Daryl's example, he mentioned, people coming into Texas might not necessarily meet our standards, but when they're in Texas, they have to, adhere to our standards of care. So that is the one thing that you are essentially letting go of, is your ability to say, I don't want this person to practice in our state if they meet everything that's set out in the compact. The state is obligated to issue them that multi-state license. So, in terms of requirements, practice, and requirements for a license, your state is not delegating anything. I think we can skip this one. I've touched on that with my previous remarks. The Social Work Compact requires social workers to pass an additional exam. This is something that we've heard a lot, particularly from social workers who, when they read the phrase qualifying national exam, they think there's some sort of extra compact exam that you have to pass. That's not the case at all. The qualifying national exam, again, like I mentioned previously, is essentially right now can only be the ASWB exam. So it's just saying to use the compact, you have to pass the ASWB exam. There's no additional exam out there, but it's something that we have heard quite a few times. I touched on that as well. What is the qualifying national exam? Can a state join the compact if it doesn't license all 3 categories of social work practice? Like we've mentioned, no. Daryl's example in Texas, he regulates all 3, but if you're a state that maybe you only regulate clinical, or you only regulate clinical and masters, you can still join at those particular levels. And the compact specifies that you join at the level where you meet the requirements. So let's say, I know there's states that are considering examination requirements at the bachelor's and master's level. So let's say, your state wants to not have an examination requirement for anyone at that bachelor's level. You could only join at the clinical level if you remove that requirement at the bachelor's level. So there's some flexibility there. Maybe you license all 3, but you don't meet the requirements for all 3. There's a little bit of flexibility to say, okay, my state meets the qualifications here at this particular level, but not these other ones, even though we still license it. So that may have confused people, and I can clarify a little bit further if people want more clarification. How does the compact treat telepractice? There's really no distinguishing between in-person practice and telepractice. There's no special carve out over here with special requirements for telepractice. It's treated essentially as another modality of practice. So there's no kind of extra steps or extra things for telepractice. It's treated essentially in the same manner as if you were seeing that client in person. Continuing education. How does the compact deal with continuing education? Again, I mentioned this previously in my remarks, but one huge advantage of the compact is that you are only doing continuing education in your home state to maintain your home state license. You're not having to do CEs in all the remote states where you may be practicing. So if you're practicing in 10 states, you only have to do CE in one state. You don't have to do it in the other 9 states. So that's a big benefit. I saw several questions in the chat about cost. How is this going to impact my board's revenue, cost to the social worker? So I'll just talk generally about cost associated with the compact. So and maybe Daryl has some perspective on this as an administrator, but what we have heard from other compacts and other boards that administer compacts is that the impact to board revenue is pretty minimal. I understand some boards are independent and self-funding. They don't get a lot of general fund allocation. And so anytime you talk about taking away a revenue source, which the compact is in a sense doing, because you're no longer having to apply as an out-of-state applicant, you're no longer having to apply to that state any longer, that can be a concern for boards. I would encourage everyone, reach out to the other boards that are in your state that have passed and implemented compacts. And I think the story that you're going to hear is that the impact is pretty minimal, if anything at all. Daryl talked about return on investment. $6,000 to participate in SciPact, and he gets, this pool of practitioners that wouldn't otherwise have access to Texas. So what we have heard at CSG is that the board impact is essentially non-existent or very minimal. But one thing to hear it from me, another thing as a board member to actually have to be responsible for your board operating. So I would just encourage you to go and talk to the other boards in your state that have implemented these compacts. In terms of cost to the social worker, so there will be a fee for the multi-state license. And like I mentioned previously, most of the time it is set either at the same fee for the regular single state license, or maybe a little bit higher. That's what we've seen in nursing, because the social worker is getting some extra value by having this license that authorizes them to practice in multiple states. So, and some of that extra fee can help offset some of the potential revenue loss, because you're not receiving as many out-of-state applicants from the board's perspective. So, those are typically the points that we share around cost and impact to board revenue. I understand the concern. Again, I would just encourage you to talk to some other boards in your state. Daryl, anything else you would add about, from your perspective in Texas, about costs?
Yeah, I mean, as far as terms of like lost revenue, we haven't noticed any decrease in our revenue. It hasn't really slowed the number of people coming to Texas applying for a license, and it hasn't impacted our revenue stream whatsoever that we can tell. So, I mean, it certainly hasn't cost us anything other than that $6,000 for the. Well, there's one thing I think probably the social work compact, y'all are going to benefit from having a much larger licensee population than what psychology has. That's going to help keep, I think it's going to help keep the cost for the commission and the member states, the pass-through cost, any members. I think it's going to help keep that down significantly compared to like what PsyPact is. So, because y'all vastly outnumber psychology in terms of numbers. So you got an economy of scale thing working in your favor here that the other profession doesn't have.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. Thank you. Okay, so those are just some of the common questions that we hear. Moving on to the audience Q&A. Thank you everybody for submitting questions in the chat, and we've got about another 35 minutes to answer audience Q&A. So Grant, I'll hand it over to you. I know you've got a list of questions for us.
Yeah, thank you. Like Matt said, thank you all for submitting questions. We're going to try and get through these so we can rather quickly, but still try to address as much as we can, so we can discuss at the end some advocacy effort initiatives. I'm going to group a few questions together here, Matt, if you could talk, and we have Kara available for some answers on questions as well from ASWB. But to talk a little bit about, how, and we talked about this during the panel some, but how the interstate compact will alleviate some workforce shortages, and how, while it may not bring in as many, a ton of licensees, sheer number of licensees, how that still can impact workforce at the state level.
Yeah, at the individual state level, and Daryl touched on this point, you have access to more providers than you did previously. At a macro level, and I saw the points being raised, are we just shuffling around social workers, or are we actually increasing the number? And at a macro level, I think where you could see an actual increase in the number of social workers, and this might not be a significant number, but we have heard stories of social workers who, navigating the licensure process was burdensome enough for them that it caused them to drop out of the workforce entirely, especially those military spouse social workers. So that's an area where there's a pool of trained, qualified social workers out there that currently aren't in the workforce that could benefit from the compact, that would see the overall pool of social workers increase. But yeah, I understand the point around, are we just kind of shuffling around people at a macro level? At an individual state level, you have access to highly qualified practitioners from your neighboring states that you can pull. You're probably going to lose some too. You're probably going to, have some social workers who choose to primarily work elsewhere. So most of the time, we usually see these things, result in kind of an equilibrium.
Thank you for that, Matt. I'm going to talk a little bit about, we've had some questions on just the process of how individuals social workers move from state to state, and then how a state's licensing platform kind of facilitates that, and how the licensing platforms interface with other jurisdiction systems, and how exactly that works with the database.
Yeah, so I can speak to the database portion, and then Grant, on the first part, you might need to get a little bit more specific as to what the question is. But so essentially, the commission will develop a shared data system that all of the member states will feed information into. So they will take information from their state data and feed it up into the commission's data system that will house information across all of the compact member states. And if you remember when I was going through section by section, section 11 talks about the data system. So you can look at section 11 and see the type of information that will be in there. Things like licensure data, so the status of that person's license in another state, presence of significant investigative information, adverse action, any previous denial of licensure, reasons for that denial, education and training information, things like that would be housed within the data system. All the member states would be able to see that, have access to that, and make decisions in their state based on that information.
Thank you, Matt. And apologies on that first question. We received a question. Does the transfer of licensure happen automatically when an individual has their multi-state license, or must they apply to states they want to practice within?
Okay, yeah. So, and again, kind of going back to the purpose of the compact. The purpose of the compact primarily is not to facilitate licensure when you're moving into another state. It's primarily meant to facilitate practicing in multiple states at one time. So not the social worker who is looking to move, but the social worker who they're staying put, they're practicing in their home state, but they just want to expand in practice in multiple states at one time. There is, like I talked about in section 7 of the compact, there is a process for an expedited exchange process where essentially if you're moving between two compact member states, if you're moving from Darrell in Texas to Annika in Utah, the Texas board is essentially going to put an expiration on that tech multi-state license, and then Utah, after they run a background check, will issue the Utah multi-state license. But there's no, you don't have to submit any transcripts. You don't have to submit any kind of retake an exam or anything like that. So it should be a fairly seamless process. You apply to the new home state, do your background check. They see, oh, okay, they're moving from another compact state. We're going to give them our version of the multi-state license, essentially.
Thank you for that, Matt. We talked about this earlier too, but it's talking about the different levels of licensure. Can a state join the compact for just one licensure level? And how does that exactly work as far as what they license when they join the compact?
Yeah, so you join the compact at whatever particular level where you meet all of the requirements. So, as we were going through the requirements, if you see, oh, okay, my state doesn't do that, you wouldn't be able to join the compact at that particular level. So, I use the example around the examination requirement just because that's, something that there's some states out there considering that. So, if you're a state that's looking to make changes to your bachelor's exam requirement or master's exam requirement, you can still join the compact at the clinical level and make those changes at the other levels if you want to. So it's not a all for one kind of thing.
You bet, Matt. And Matt, on this next question, if you want me to hit on any points here, I'm glad to do so, but I'll shoot it to you first. Can you talk about the background check issue with some states?
Yeah, and Grant's been kind of knee deep in our efforts around this topic. So the compact does require a FBI background check process for anybody that is seeking a multi-state license. So if you're a social worker, you want to use the compact, you're going to have to do a background check. I think what the question is getting at is there are significant issues between the FBI and these compact commissions in their ability to process and make determinations on a state's decision around a background check. So there, and this is an ongoing thing, there's actually legislation at the federal level in Congress. It's called the SHARE Act, and Grant can talk a little bit about that. That would essentially change the FBI's mandate to better work with these compact commissions. So in short, I would just say CSG is doing all we can to try to solve this. All of the other licensure compacts are doing all we can to try to solve this. There is a lot of effort and resources going to try to resolve this issue because it will materially impact the compact's ability to function if we can't sort out this background check issue. So the medical compact is having issues, the nursing compact's having issues, all the ones that are active are having issues with these FBI background checks. And so it's very important, and we're putting a lot of effort into hopefully this solution in Congress. But Grant, anything else you want to say about the SHARE Act?
Not a whole lot, except for the fact that really due to kind of an inconsistent interpretation by the FBI and their affiliates in the states that do background checks. And this is an issue compacts have seen in a very small capacity because it's not an issue in a huge amount of states, but still a relevant issue nonetheless. For some notes on the SHARE Act, there's currently legislation that has been introduced federally in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's bipartisan legislation, has over 20 sponsors and co-sponsors representing a bipartisan group as well of Democrats and Republicans, and representing, I think, over 15 states and territories. So work is currently being done to address this issue, and hopefully this won't be an issue by the time the Social Work Compact Commission is up and running. So
yeah, absolutely. Just one more thing, you might when we're talking about talking with legislators and advocacy and stuff, you might hear this get brought up, is these problems that some of these compacts are having with background checks. And so I would say from a what to respond, how to respond to that, you could share that CSG and all of the active licensure compacts are working really hard to try to resolve the issue, and we're pretty confident that it'll be resolved in the near future. So there are states that have said, we don't want to pass any more of these until this is taken care of. So it is a pretty significant issue that needs resolving.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for anyone advocating in your state and this issue comes up, please reach out to us. We've got a lot of information and resources we can provide legislators and stakeholders to help address this, which we are happy to do. Moving on with questions from the chat. How have talking about paying for the data system? Maybe how have some other compacts paid for their commission's data system?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll preface this by saying, as technology advances, the cost of this type of data system is drastically decreasing. 10 years ago, when nursing built their nurses data system, they probably spent over $1 million on it to develop it. When you're talking about a data system that has millions of pieces of data, lots of different entities uploading information into, housing all of that, that's a significant endeavor. But as cloud-based solutions have been emerging, and new tech vendors that can do this type of thing in an easier manner, the costs have been coming down a lot. So, but all of that to say that it is a significant cost for the commission up front to be able to build out this data system. Most of the compacts that currently have data systems received support from outside organizations, from professional associations, and organizations within the profession who want to see the compact come into effect. There are federal grants out there. I know their SciPact was funded their data system from a HRSA grant. I think the Medical Compact was also from a HRSA grant. So there's funding at the federal level as well. And we've heard from HRSA that they want to provide support to these compact commissions as they start emerging, particularly the ones around mental health and telehealth. That's a big priority at HRSA. And so I feel pretty confident that there will be enough resources once we pull everything together that supporting the data system shouldn't be a significant issue.
You bet. Next question we have, a really important one. From your experience with Compact so far, what are some of the major roadblocks to getting it passed in states? And maybe some of the major sticking points which people have enjoyed as well.
Yeah, great question. It's amusing because, hearing Daryl and thinking back on our drafting process, we spend so much time talking about, the requirements for the social worker, the requirements, all of the kind of social work specific requirements. And then you talk to a legislator and all they care about is the commission's rulemaking power and perception around, us losing our state sovereignty. So those are the things that the legislators really care about. So, and those can be sticking points if you don't have good talking points around how the compact protects those things. So, really understanding what the commission is, what they're authorized to do, how they can't, act outside of the terms of the agreement. None of their rules apply to any licensees outside of the compact. Knowing all of those things and being able to articulate all that is important to combating some of those concerns. But yeah, perceptions around the commission, perceptions around the compact kind of infringing on state sovereignty. Daryl touched on this point, but a perception that by joining the compact, I am accepting practitioners who have lower standards, who don't meet the high bar that we set in our state. And I say these are all perceptions because when you take a step back and look at it from a macro level, really these states aren't very dissimilar in terms of the requirements for a license. There's a lot more in common than there is different. And so, being able to have answers around the initial things that I mentioned, and then kind of explaining how, this person from our neighboring state really was not trained in a radically different way than we train our social workers here in our state. So those are probably the primary ways in which a compact will not be successful. And then, also to emphasize, this is a bill that is subject to partisan politics and political games. So you might just get stuck in a situation where the committee chair doesn't like the bill sponsor and isn't going to hear any other bills, or there's an argument between the R's and the D's, and that's caught, so it's a bill just like any other bill that's subject to the political process. And so I think having lobbyists to help navigate those sticky situations can be helpful as well if you have the resources at a organization level to employ something like that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Matt. Another question we've had, and I know some conversation in the chat about too. Can you all address the possibility of out-of-state social workers flooding the market via telehealth or just in-person work, flooding the market and reducing wages?
So my initial response to that, and Jennifer, Kara, maybe you have some perspective on this as well. My initial response to that would be there are already large telehealth companies that are operating on the current licensure system. And I don't really foresee a scenario where the compact is going to like materially impact their business model. I think, you know, it'll make it a little bit easier for social workers to practice without having to go through the licensure process. But those telehealth companies are already navigating the current licensure process. So I don't really see a material impact here in terms of, you know, a big telehealth company coming in and saturating the a market. And I'll say, you know, that's my opinion, and I'm speculating there, but we haven't seen any evidence of that with any of the other compacts. You know, particularly a telehealth compact like psychology, we certainly haven't seen that come to fruition there. So Jennifer, Kara, anything you have any perspective on that question?
The only thing I would add is I think Kara showed that we've seen a 36% increase in licensees across the US in the past 10 years. And I don't think any state on this call would report having too many licensed social workers in their state. So even though we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of licensees just in general, we're not seeing a glut of social workers. And so I don't see how the compact would be different, but similar to Matt, I would just be forecasting there. And we don't have the data about workforce to really back that up.
Thank you for that, Jennifer and Matt. Definitely those are important points to consider. And then, you know, if we've heard throughout this process so much that there's just a huge need for social workers in almost every state. So that's great context.
Can I add just a practice element to that?
Absolutely.
I think it's important just as a policy issue that we have that concern, but I think the delivery of all healthcare across telemedicine, not every telemedicine service provider is created equal. Not every telehealth provider is created equal or regulated equally. But here's the truth. Not every client has equal access. And so, I've started really looking at these big telehealth companies, and they're very big. But I look at them as technology companies who've commodified a service, not so much as a telehealth provider. And, we're starting to see quality issues in the system of care. If and or when I apply for my compact license, there's a little bit more on the line for me to make sure that my practice is, I am delivering it with excellence. I am delivering it with competence. I am knowledgeable and compliant about the laws and the community needs of the non-resident clients that I might be serving. So I think as much as we look at that big monster of the economics of telehealth delivery, I think the free market is really starting to, there's some things that are starting to settle out. And, I'm hearing from clients that I don't want to do that. I had a bad experience. That's not the service delivery for me. I'm hearing that, oh, this helped me because I wasn't able to get my kid to an appointment and it expanded the access. Reimbursement for telehealth is the big variable that we worry about, especially in terms of mental health delivery. But, again, it's a very complex and nuanced issue. And I really think it's important that in our social work community, we actually really try to see those as separate issues because they're very compact licensure versus, a big commodified for-profit telehealth delivery company that has a business model. That business model will adapt just like our business models need to adapt or our service delivery models need to adapt. But they can be two separate issues. Do I think that big, large telehealth companies need more regulation? Yes, I actually do, because I think that there's a lot of really poor quality service, but I also think there's some good quality service. And so, if we care about the social justice of expanded access for people, again, not everybody can pay a cash pay rate to access telehealth. I think our professional organizations play a huge role in setting standard of practice. I think licensure, has a role in protecting the public. We just haven't really seen all of the factors play into it. But I can see why that would be an initial concern of this is just a way to exploit the mental health workforce for profit. I don't really see it that way, right? Because we still have individual practitioners who are subject to the terms of this compact license, right? To include practicing competently and safely. So that might not be a satisfying response to your concern, because I do really share your concern, but I do see them as separate issues really needing to be talked about in a separate way, because we just simply don't have the data that shows that, there's going to just be a massive amount of unsafe care for low rates being delivered to vulnerable people who need telehealth delivered services.
Thank you so much for that added context, Annika and Jennifer and Matt. We really appreciate all the questions coming in, but towards the end of this presentation, we're going to give some tips and tricks on advocacy, which I think in this part of the process is one of the most important things we can discuss right now. But to wrap up with one final question, it's been a major concern, for practitioners throughout this process of addressing the issue of varying legal standards that vary from state to state. This is, especially relevant with issues related to abortion and gender affirming care. As we discussed, passing the compact, and then maybe some of the resources that Matt could be addressed by the commission, or Jennifer, maybe ASWB could support in as well. I'll turn it to you first, Matt.
Yeah, so again, the principle here with the compact is that you are subject to the laws and rules of the state where you're practicing, regardless of the state that issued you your license. So if you are licensed in a state that, gender affirming care was used as an example. So if you're licensed in a state that allows you to do that, you're practicing in a state that does not allow you to do that, you've got to know, okay, I'm practicing in this state, I can't do that here. And it's up to the social worker to know that and understand the laws and rules where they're practicing. So that's, the point we've continually made so far around states retaining their sovereignty. We couldn't possibly create something that would be viable that dictates to states what they have to have in their laws and rules. And it's not just laws and rules in the Practice Act, but it's all a state's laws and rules. So even if it's not something specifically laid out in the Social Work Practice Act, it's all of the state's laws and rules. It's essentially, somebody mentioned the driver's license example was helpful for them. So let's, flesh it out a little bit further. Let's say, you're driving in another state that doesn't allow you to turn right on red. Maybe the state where your license does. You have to know, okay, I'm in this state, I can't turn right on red. And if you do, you're going to get pulled over and they're going to say, we don't want you to drive here anymore. So same principle applies here with the compact. You've got to know what you're allowed to do in the remote state where you're practicing. And if you violate that state's laws and rules, then you're under the subject to the jurisdiction of the board in that state.
Thank you for that. And I know with a lot of different compacts and commissions, once they become active, we'll start to work towards providing some resources or some help for individuals to get a better understanding of the different laws and rules that you have to follow in different states.
Well, one more thing, Grant, on this. Yeah. So let's say it's actually the converse, and you are providing your license in a state that has banned gender affirming care, and you're practicing in a state that allows it. The state that licensed you has no ability to discipline you for activity that occurred in another state that was legal in that state. So if you're providing gender affirming care in another state where it was legal, the state that has licensed you, that has made that illegal, they don't have a right to take action against you for providing services that are legal in the state where you are providing them. So this is not going to be like a fishing expedition where, you know, states that have, you know, maybe more restrictions on practice are going to be out there policing and trying to, you know, find social workers who are doing things that are you know, prohibited in their laws and rules. If the compact explicitly says if it's legal, if you're providing services that are legal in a, you know, state where you're not licensed, then another state has no grounds to discipline you for that.
That's a great point, Matt, and a good reminder that the compact does not dictate scope of practice in any state. So thank you for that, and thank you everyone for submitting your questions. Now we're going to transition towards the back end of the presentation where we talk about getting involved. I'm going to lead this section, and we've got a few good tips and tricks, and then the groups you can work with as well when you are advocating for the social work compact in your state. So I'm going to work quickly through some of these advocacy stakeholders. Two of the most important ones on here are the ones that are on the ground in each state where professionals and individuals are trying to get compact passed. One is our NASW chapters, who are incredibly helpful in this process of moving the social work compact and other pieces of important social work legislation through in the legislature. They're great for state level advocacy. And then another great tool individuals can use is social work boards. We know their jurisdiction for introducing legislation varies quite a bit from state to state, but if you need information on your state's regulatory laws and stipulations and how that compact can impact licensure in your state, a social work board is a great resource to go to. Some more good resources for some specific aspects of passing compact legislation. Us here at CSG, we are a great resource to have within the National Center for Interstate Compacts. Part of our duty as a technical information center for compacts. So we'll have our emails and contact information later at the very end of this presentation. You all can have, and feel free to please reach out to us with any compact related questions. Compacts work or aspects such as that. Also, the SHARE Act and any background check issues we've heard in the past, we can be a good resource for that as well. As we spoke to earlier, we had Tammy on, and she talked about the perspective from the Department of Defense and how they've been just an integral partner in not just the social work licensure compact, but so many licensure compacts that we're working on with our cooperative agreement with them. And they're a great resource for how this can impact military spouses and military families, which is a huge driver of licensure compacts in so many states. And as well, I know we've heard, especially with the social work compact, this being a mental health a bill as much as it is a licensure compact bill, how much support can be given to veterans mental health and active duty service members as well. And I know Tammy in the Defense State Liaison Office is a great resource there. And I know her slides are on this presentation. So once we send it out to the group, you can have information from her slides on her colleagues that work in the different regions for the Defense State Liaison Office throughout the country, and their contact information will be on there and how you can reach out to them. Our last advocacy stakeholder is really one of the key stakeholders in this process, and that is the legislators themselves who pass the legislation. This is the group that you've got to really push and to work with to get it passed in your state. And then, but having a coalition of efforts from NASW chapters, social work boards, the Defense State Liaison Office, and then us here at CSG can help so much in those conversations with legislators. And on that point, we're going to move on to some tiers of different levels of involvement you can do really based on your capacity and ability to do so. At the very top of the list of tiers of involvement is finding a bill sponsor in that legislator group we talked about just moments ago. Finding that bill sponsor who good tricks for that are someone who's maybe advocated for compacts or mental health profession, social work, licensure issues in the past. Someone with a bit of a relation or committees members as well. And helping to shepherd that compact through the legislative process, maybe talking to other legislators about the importance of it, committee chairs, important members of your legislature. Another huge thing that NASW chapters are doing across the country is holding state association lobby days, where the NASW chapter and their members go out to your state capital and speak with legislators on the compact, and then really other important issues going on in social work professional arena. And that's a great opportunity for you to get on the ground at your state capital talking with those who represent you. As compacts move along in the process, just like all legislation, in states, they have to go through a committee hearing. Testifying in support of that committee hearing. A lot of committees, these kind of rules vary by state, but most states allow for individuals to testify in support or against bills at a committee hearing. And going to put that effort forward to testifying in support of a bill really shows legislators in that committee there's real live people out there that will be impacted by this legislation. We'd encourage people to do that if able. Organizing voter voice campaigns is another great tactic to get to work with other social workers or maybe just other individuals who are voters in your state. Maybe they work pretty commonly with legislators. Maybe individuals who utilize social work services are a great advocate for the compact as well. To know that there's multiple lenses and multiple impacts will be passed by the social work compact. On our website, it's swcompact.org, which we will have the link to later in this presentation. Writing a letter on that website is a template letter of support you can use to write letters of support to your legislator, and writing them showing your support for the social work compact. And we encourage as many people who are able to do so to go onto our website and check that out and maybe fill out a letter for your state legislature. Just working hand in hand with your state NASW chapter. Encourage everyone to reach out to your chapter and just express your support and how important it is for them. I know Annika talked about the importance of NASW chapters having a conversation about the compact together and being in unison on their support for that and how important that is. And then, as we mentioned, we have a great amount of educational resources on swcompact.org. We encourage everyone to check those out as a first step before you start advocating through your NASW chapter, your social work board, or legislature. After reviewing those materials, we hope that you will be prepared and ready to really advocate for the social work compact strongly, and having the background knowledge to do that, and just sharing a lot of that information with your network, with people you work with. Maybe some people aren't aware of the importance of this or that it's even active. So we encourage people to have those conversations with your colleagues. So moving on, some important notes here, things we've touched on a bit, but it's very important to talk when you're talking with both bill sponsors and bill drafters alike. It's so essential to use the final compact language from swcompact.org. Compacts, as we've said, thrive on uniformity, and that commission will review, and the CSG, we will review that final language and compare it with our model language, which is on the website. With that being said, we want to get a hold of that language as early as possible. So if there are any slight changes in it that are material, we can go ahead and address those and get those changed as early in the process as possible, because that definitely makes it the easiest. The earlier we can catch it, the most likely we are to make that change and get a good compact bill, which is materially the same as that model language. We do have Word versions available. I'm hopeful for a good amount of bill drafters to just kind of adjust the language without making material changes, something that's accommodated to their rules in their respective states. So please contact us if that's needed. If a bill sponsor or drafter lets you know that's needed. And as we said, no substantive or material changes can be made to the language that differs from our model act on the website. Moving on to the next slide. Here you'll see a few screenshots from swcompact.org. We encourage all of you to view this page and our educational resources there. We also have, as you can see in the middle of the screen, a map, so you can track how the progress is going in all 50 states and territories. Then there's some other educational material as well you can share with your network, legislators, and those alike. So our contact information is there on the bottom right of the screen. Any questions you all get, of course, compact related, or if you just need some help finding your state chapter or individuals with your social work board to get into touch with, we're glad to help with that as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us at our emails, which are there on the bottom of the screen. And as I said, we will be distributing this PowerPoint, and there will be a recording available as well. So all of this will be available to you beyond this presentation. So I think that will wrap us up, and I will hand it over to Matt for some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Grant. Just wanted to thank everybody so much for your time and attention. Understand 3 hours is a very long Zoom call. So, but hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully it was helpful. And again, just want to thank our partners at the Department of Defense for making all this possible through the cooperative agreement, and also our fantastic partners at ASWB and all of the NASW folks that we've worked with up to this point. So we're very excited about 2024, and we really feel like there's just going to be an explosion of states that pass the compact, and so we're excited to get the ball rolling there. But like Grant said, don't hesitate to reach out in the next couple of months if you are doing some strategy around planning for the next legislative session. We're happy to be a part of all of those conversations. So with that, thank you all and have a great rest of your day.